Hi everyone, it's Dr. Loyola here, and this is our class day lecture on geolocative narrative, which will close out the geolocative narrative unit of interactive fiction. So in this lecture, I'm going to talk about first just some quick review of what is geolocative narrative. What do we mean by these terms? Certainly we talked about this before spring break, and I've mentioned it a few times throughout the semester, but I think it's a good kind of starting point to just get us all on the same page in that regard. The next thing is another item of review, and that is this next term that we've kind of thrown in with this particular unit, and that is immersion, right? So the two sides to this class are interaction and immersion. So we'll be reviewing what immersion is and how that fits into geolocative narrative. Then I'm going to spend most of this video talking about mobile storytelling under what we can think of as ideal conditions, which would be conditions where you can actually go out and do a mobile narrative. Looking specifically at the silent history, which is the text that we all would have done this week, but of course we can't because we can't really go anywhere and can't share iOS devices. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about that text and some of the ways that it works with mobile storytelling to give you some ideas moving towards your prototype. I'll also put that in conversation with Greenspan's article, which hopefully you've read before this video, though certainly you can read it after this, that's fine. But things will probably make a bit more sense if you've read it already. So if you haven't, consider this your warning that you should turn off the video, go read that, and then come back. Okay, and then to close out, I'll talk a little bit about the prototype that you'll actually be building, just to give you a sense of kind of what you'll be doing, what tools you'll be working with, and what some of the goals of that prototype will be. Okay, so what is geolocative storytelling? Well, as many of you will recall, this is storytelling where the narrative is bound to a location through the integration of geographical data, right? So it uses the world and actual spaces to create a fully immersive narrative experience, or supposedly that's the goal of it, right? But of course, if you've read Greenspan, you know that he will kind of take this to task a little bit of how immersive a geolocative narrative can actually be. And we'll talk a little bit more later on about what is getting in the way of that immersion. But nevertheless, when we tend to think of geolocative storytelling, we tend to think of it as something that's aimed to, that ties location to the content and the technology, right? So that data at the back end and also what's actually happening in the narrative in order to create a fully immersive environment or a fully immersive experience. So yes, as I just said. So these kinds of storytelling can follow two different models that we've looked at this semester. One model, of course, is the map-based model, where it's exclusively map-based with something like the LA Flood Project, which uses the map as the interface in order to tie the story to specific places, but is still ultimately experienced virtually through a computer screen. Right, so in this case, it's a story of an imaginary flood hitting LA. And as you can see from this map, that story is tagged at all these different locations. And each one of these little map pins will reveal a different part of the narrative. And when we talked about this in class, a lot of you noted that you didn't particularly care for the aspect of it being through a computer, right? That because you were tied to Google Maps and just kind of sitting at home or wherever, that kind of took you out of the immersion a little bit, right? That it was really just kind of like using a difficult map, right? That it wasn't really easy to figure out what order you were supposed to experience different parts of the narrative in. Like if we look just at this map, should we start with a swimmer? Should we start with a purple pin? There's no real sequence offered to us here, right? So that doesn't make for a particularly comfortable narrative experience, right? Because it doesn't give us a nice chronology, a nice order to follow. And so then in part way, because of this, because it was hard to immerse yourself in the narrative at all, it was also hard to move past that kind of computer barrier and actually immerse yourself in the map, right? And in the environment that had been built through this mapping technology. And then, of course, another model for this type of storytelling is mobile-based, right? Where it's based in a mobile app and you actually move through space, right? And as you move through space, the story unfolds, usually by some kind of geotag or other method that makes the story reveal itself as you travel through the world, right? So Pokemon Go is perhaps the most immediately accessible example of this model. but Zombies Run, of course, also works on this model. And then I'll also just add that silent history follows the same model, which is what we, of course, would have been doing. And that, as I said, I will be spending a little bit more time on later today, but I just want to be really clear right now that silent history kind of falls in this model. It's not the LA flood model, it's the mobile app moving through space model. Okay, so now that we've all caught up on geolocative narrative and we're all kind of clear on that, let's hop into our second agenda item, which is reviewing this concept of immersion and immersiveness. So the flip side of this class's focus on interaction is, of course, this focus on immersion, right? So how we can create environments that are fully immersive in their interaction, right? And where audiences feel like, or players, our readers, whoever, that they feel like they're really in this world that we've built and that they're interacting with. This is usually something that people think about VR with, but of course in this class, we're not going to be doing any VR. We're going to be thinking about it more from a design perspective of what are the kinds of things that you need to be thinking about more broadly, letting the technology and the particular media come second. So as you'll recall from before spring break, immersion is the sense of being fully surrounded by, fully engaged in, almost transported to, right, part of this narrative world. And Greenspan, of course, will mention this issue of being transported in his article as well, and the ways that geolocative narrative seeks to transport you through the world in order to transport you out of the world, or such is the goal, right? So immersion is what means all this, right? This idea of being fully engaged in this narrative world. And it's achieved, as we talked about again before spring break, by controlling the sensory input that your audience has access to, right? And so it's controlling it as much as you possibly can so that the input that your audience is given is only input that they should be getting from the diegetic world or the fictional narrative world, not from the real world or the world that they're watching or really living in, right? They're watching the movie in, the world that they're reading from, right? But rather that it's just the content coming from the world that you're creating. And this term that I've just used, diegetic or diegesis, that's something that, again, we talked about before spring break. And this is a term that is borrowed from film studies and that essentially is this idea of separating worlds, right? And that there's the real world or the non-diegetic world, and then there's a world that takes place within the film. And that these two worlds might look very similar, right? Even in like a realistic film that's set in this space, not like a Harry Potter type of film, which this screenshot is from, but like any kind of realistic kind of world. There's rules that exist in that diegesis and in that narrative world that don't exist in our world. And those rules might be as simple as this character actually exists, or they could be as complex as, you know, an entire secret wizarding world as in Harry Potter, right? And so because of that, one of the ways that we need to play with immersion and this like concept of the diegesis is to understand how to move between these two worlds and how to control your audience and keep them in the diegetic world and not let the non-diegetic or the outside real world kind of intrude, right? And we do that by controlling sensory input, right? And making sure, as in this scene from Harry Potter, that all of the content that the audience is getting is only the content that would exist in this particular world. So if you can remember from before spring break, we watched this clip where Harry first enters Diagon Alley with Hagrid for the first time, and we had this great kind of swelling soundtrack that plays behind him as he comes in. And even though that's one of these kind of funky things in film that does not exist in the diegesis, meaning that Harry doesn't hear that soundtrack, but we hear it. But because we hear it, it helps us immerse into the diegesis because it sets a tone for us, right? It makes us understand that this is a wonderful, magical, like upbeat, positive experience for him. It's not scary. It's not suspenseful. It's not uncomfortable, right? Which, if we really think about it, this kind of idea that behind the real world there's this secret wizarding world full of magic animals and flying broomsticks and whatever, that should actually be really terrifying, right? But part of how they achieve making it not terrifying is by giving us that immersive soundtrack that sets that tone. And the other thing that that soundtrack does is it blocks out any sounds from our world, right? So it controls our sensory input both by providing actual input and by stopping other input from intruding, right? So because we're listening to this soundtrack, we're not hearing things like car alarm outside or a baby crying or a phone going off or something else that shouldn't belong in that world, right? And as we all know, if we've been in a movie theater or another narrative experience where something like this has happened, we know that that's actually really disruptive, right? That when a cell phone rings, it takes you completely out of whatever's happening because the cell phone isn't supposed to ring in this particular part of the movie, right? And cell phones don't even exist in Harry Potter. Okay, and I just want to make the point that even though sound is very important, it's of course not the only sense, right? There's four others, and to the extent that you're able, right, one of the goals of immersive storytelling is to be able to control each one of these sensory input points, right? So in movies, we especially see work being done with sound, but if we think more expansively to immersive environments like Disney World or even escape rooms, right, we can see playing with other senses, right? Playing with smell, playing with what you can see, playing even perhaps with what you can taste, what you can feel, right? What kinds of things you can touch in the world, and so on. But of course, we also want to acknowledge that in each case, designers are ultimately working towards a best case immersive scenario. And this is something that's especially important to keep in mind as we're going towards a geolocative immersive environment, because there are always certain things that you just can't control when we're thinking about controlling sensory input, right? So if we continue with our Disney World example, Orlando is never going to be cold enough to really achieve the kind of snow-covered Wizarding World kind of vibe that they're going for, right? And yet that's just something that the designers go with, right? They hope that the sounds, the visuals, and everything else is going to be enough to overcome the fact that it's, 1,000 degrees and 1,000% humidity, right, in the swamp. Okay, so moving to our third item, which is looking at mobile storytelling. We're going to start with a quick review of where we've been on this particular area. So looking at the text that we've talked about so far, and then I'll talk a little bit more in depth about the silent history and some of the ways that it actually uses mobile storytelling that's different from the examples that we've seen so far in this class, and some things that you might be interested in incorporating in your own prototypes. Okay, so for this class, Zombies Run was our example of a mobile text that uses the real-world environment to create an immersive narrative experience. And as you all hopefully remember from playing this is primarily an audio narrative where the story unfolds through sound-based feedback as you move through space. And it imagines a zombie apocalypse that's really happening in your world, and you have to run or move through space to escape zombies or achieve certain missions, collect supplies, and whatever else you might need in this particular zombie scenario. Importantly, though, the feedback that you get is not triggered by space as you move, right? It's not that as you get to each of these red points on this map, you get a new piece of the story. It's that as you move a set distance or for a set time or some other metric, but it's a metric based on movement, that is when you get the next piece of the story, right? So it's not a location trigger, it's a movement trigger. So what that also means is that if we think back to Greenspan's article, this would be an example of mobile storytelling that prioritizes the edge, right, rather than the node. In other words, this is mobile storytelling that is about the movement from place to place and the method of movement and the fact of that movement, the speed of that movement, and so on, rather than just getting to the place itself. So if we think about this in terms of Pokemon Go, that's one where how you get from one Pokemon location to the next really doesn't matter to the fact of a Pokemon being there, right? You could drive, you could ride a bike, you could walk, you could run, you could do whatever you want. And the Pokemon will still be in that location regardless of how you get there. Zombies Run follows a slightly different model where it doesn't matter where you are, it matters how you're moving between these places as to how you're going to get that story. And importantly, when we discussed this in class, many of you actually noted that you felt that this wasn't necessarily to its benefit, right? That just being able to get the story as you're moving wasn't necessarily as immersive as you might have liked, because it didn't actually engage with your surroundings fully, right? It only engaged on kind of these two sensory points, movement or feeling and sound, rather than also engaging with things like what you could see, what was around you, or maybe perhaps what you were hearing, smelling, tasting, whatever. I'm sorry, obviously not hearing. The story was what you were hearing. So with that in mind, these are some shots from my neighborhood. And so we could imagine, right, that in doing Zombies Run through this particular space, it might be kind of cool if it had the dynamic capability of saying something like, oh, look out for, we know that there's zombies that hide in this swamp that's just come up, or, oh yes, last week we caught a pack of zombies right by this sidewalk, by that stop sign, so be careful as you run up towards it. Or even something like, there's a packet of supplies hidden on the other side of this lake, right, or something like that. And in these ways, it would actually engage with the environment while also giving us that feedback. Allowing for this kind of dynamism would actually be very cool, but it's just simply not the way that this particular one works. Okay, so the silent history, however, does work in this way, right? So the silent history is primarily text-based as opposed to Zombies Run's audio-based method of storytelling. And it also works on the model of locative fiction, the alternative model that Greenspan notes, which is the focus on the node, right, or the location itself to trigger the next block of text. So this is one where, similar to Pokemon Go, it doesn't matter as much how you get to the location, as long as you get there in some way, and that you get there close enough with your phone, with location services turned on, to actually trigger the next piece of, so that your phone, it's recognized that your phone is actually in that location so that it can trigger the next piece of the story. So in this instance, we do want to be sure that to understand that the technology that's happening behind the scenes, right, is that this content is actually locked behind a geotag. So if you look at this image on the slide, each of these little red hexagons with numbers in it, that's geotagged content. So if we look at that cluster kind of on Florida, that's 15 little pieces of story that are there. There's 53 in New York, maybe Washington, D.C., 11 in Texas, right, and so on. So each of those are locked content that I can't access, you can't access from here, because as you can see, my location dot is not on any one of these areas. So should I go to one of those places in Florida or New York or DC or wherever, then it would actually open up that piece of text and I would have access to that next piece of the story. And this is actually, I think, a really cool model of interactive fiction, interactive storytelling, because of the ways that it actually uses interaction with the world as part of the storytelling process and as part of the narrative design. So in this case, we're doing less interaction with a computer directly, right? We're not typing commands as we do in a parser. We're not clicking on links as we do in a hypertext, right? We're simply moving through the world with our technology on and allowing that to let us know when we've identified or when we've come in contact with a piece of the story, right? Perhaps we're following a map, right? Most likely. But beyond that, right, that's kind of, the interaction has shifted, right? And our primary interaction is with the world and with our actual environment, rather than simply with our technology. And of course, there's problems with this kind of interaction with the world and this interaction with the world with a goal of total immersion in a narrative, right? And Greenspan points out some of these problems near the end of his article. But there are also problems that I'm guessing you all saw when Pokemon Go first hit the market. And that is that, on the one hand, you can't fully immerse yourself in this environment because you still have to pay attention to your actual environment, right? Like, we're not, as much as we want to imagine that we're in the silent history world or the Pokemon world or whatever, we're still in this world in a very real way. And we can still walk into a busy street. We can run into a building. We could run into other people, right? We still have to be aware of all of our surroundings in those ways. There's places we can't actually go, right, that are illegal or fenced off or whatever, right, and all these kinds of things. So that's one side of it, is that you just simply can't immerse fully because you have to pay attention. The other side of it is that there's a limit to the kind of immersion that you can have just by the logistics of moving through the world. And some of those logistics having to do with access. So as we know, right, very in a real way right now, is that we can't always move through the world equally or consistently or in these equitable ways, right? And there's limits to how we can move through the world at various times. And these limits can be something like we're experiencing now, which is, a pandemic that says everybody stay where you are and don't hang out. It could be something that's like money, right? That we simply can't afford to hop on a plane and fly to Vancouver to read that one little story that's locked there, right? These are real limits, right? And real kind of access issues when we think about this kind of fiction. And this is actually something that has been a pretty strong critique that's been launched against locative fiction, that it really kind of locks out and has problems with access because of the ways that it is based in actual space and the ways that not everybody can move through space equitably. But I do want to kind of back up from that just a little bit, though, because even though it's an important thing to keep in mind, all technology has these kinds of critiques, right? Like we could think about access problems for just being able to have a laptop, having a reliable internet connection. Again, all these kinds of issues of access that we're kind of experiencing in real time right now in our classes as we've moved to this kind of massive online model. But when we talk about locative narrative, I think this is an especially loud critique and an especially strong critique because the rhetoric of mobile reading and of mobile devices and reading is such that it should be increasing access, right, and taking away barriers. And Greenspan talks a lot about this early in his article when he talks about the role that Kindles play and audiobooks play and the rhetoric that Amazon and Barnes & Noble and Apple and whoever else, the rhetoric that they give to the Kindle that can be accessed anywhere, right? And this idea that no matter where you are, you can always access some kind of really good literature through your device, right? And that these devices exist, and if you're going to be reading through a mobile device, that's a reading that is predicated on increasing access. And of course, locative fiction, such as the silent history, really challenges that because we literally cannot access all of the content unless we are in the precise location. So that's just something to kind of keep in mind, right? That this is kind of a give and take that we're playing with here when designing for locative experiences, is that there's always this issue of access, always this issue of like, what kind of audience can you reasonably have based on just constraints of space. Okay, so with that in mind, we're now going to turn to the silent history. And I'm going to try to show you how one of the things that I really like about it is that even though this issue of access really is an important thing to think about with locative media, it actually deals with that in these really kind of interesting ways because of the ways that its narrative is structured, even within this locative space. So the silent history is a long-form narrative. It's geolocative, so it is based in blocks of location data, but it's written for a popular audience, and it imagines an alternative future, and future in big scare quotes, because as you can see here, the story takes place from 2011 to 2041, so it's one of these futures that's quickly becoming the present. And it was created in 2014, so 2011 was already the past when it was created, so that's kind of a purposeful temporal dissonance that they're doing there. And so to the point of this question of access, right, and this issue of access, and my point that I think the silent history kind of does smart things with that, is first that the narrative that it tells is a narrative that we would consider a popular genre, right? So this is kind of a science fiction-y kind of space. This is a very accessible genre. It's very accessible writing. So it's a locative narrative that is explicitly not for like a scholarly or artistic elite group, right? This is not a postmodern text. This is a very like easy to read, kind of normal seeming text, with the one cool thing being, or kind of weird thing being, that it is meant to be consumed through a mobile device and with these location tags. So in addition to that, as I mentioned, it's set in our world and in our time, which again helps us identify it as a popular audience, a popular narrative, because it's again not setting us in some kind of like funky, weird space that you can't really access or can't really understand unless you're just used to reading or experiencing those kinds of narratives. And then the narrative itself, I already mentioned that it's easy to read. It's a bit like newspapers or magazines. But more than that, it's a story that's made up of a collection of like eyewitness accounts of this future phenomenon where for some reason kids are born without the ability to access language. And that's going to completely disrupt the schooling infrastructure. It's going to disrupt working infrastructures. And you kind of follow a bunch of different people throughout this 30-year span as they deal with this world that's kind of reeling from this new reality where the youngest generation can't speak in any way. So the narrative is made up of these small eyewitness accounts that are divided into two groups: testimonials and field reports. And the testimonials, each of these are like short form pieces of content that take, 5 to 10 minutes to read. So again, that's a point where this is bringing us to that question of access, where not only are they thinking about the genre, right, and the fact that this is a accessible text generically for any kind of audience, set in our world, our time, accessible through mobile device, but it's also able to be read in small snippets, right, in 5 to 10 minutes. So it's not for the person who can sit down and just read an 800-page novel because they have all the time in the world, right? It's for the person who maybe has 5 or 10 minutes on their phone and just wants to dip into this story periodically, right? So again, that's one of the ways that it's expanding how we can think of this problem of access within locative narrative. Okay, so the testimonials, and this is the interface that you would use to access the testimonials. These are the main story of the app that was actually written by the authors and the creators of this app. And these are ones that anybody can access regardless of where they are. So as long as you have the app, you can read this core story that spans these these 30 years, these 3 decades of the silent history. And in fact, if you're looking for something to do, I would strongly recommend doing this. It's a great text. If you have an iOS device, it's definitely worth checking out. It's kind of a cool, funky little realistic dystopia, as I said, but not in a weird, plaguey kind of way. So this is the testimonials. Anybody can access them. Go for it if you feel like it. But besides that, they also have the field reports. So the field reports are the geolocatively tagged content. So this is the content that's only accessible if you're actually in that location. And with the exception of a really small handful of field reports, the majority of them are not written by the primary authors of this app. Instead, they're written by the app's audience, right? The readers or the fans. So kind of a little bit like fan fiction and crowdsourcing. So what the creators of this app have done is that they've effectively crowdsourced these stories to build out their world and to create, ideally, a kind of geolocative set of stories that could span the entire globe. And as you can see, there's quite a bit of them all over the world. So what's going on here, and again, thinking about this question of access, is that this is then inviting the audience to come into the text to immerse themselves so fully in this world, right, that's been built in this silent history, that they can then write their own stories in their own voices about their own experiences in this alternative fiction, right, in this alternative space. And then they can submit those tagged to their community, right, so geolocatively locked down to the actual app, and it will show up here in that location space. So the idea here is that anyone could get the app, read the testimonials, and then build out this location interface so that anyone around the world could access any parts of the story. So unfortunately, at this point, none of the stories are set in Myrtle Beach. And full disclosure, the original version of this class, before we moved online, I did have an extra credit opportunity, which was to contribute a field report tagged here and submit it to actually be included in the collection. And I will still honor that if you would like to pursue that extra credit option. Don't do that unless you actually have the time and the space and the interest, but I will honor that extra credit if you do that. Lucky for you though, and for today, there are a ton of field reports, as you can see on this map, in Los Angeles. There's about 50 over in California, and I want to say 30 or so of them are in LA. And that's where I did my PhD. So I have some records of that content, which I'm going to share with you now so that you can get a sense of how this narrative works to immerse their audience in these real spaces and how these field reports actually use the space of the city and the space of these different neighborhoods and communities in the storytelling process. And of course, this is with the idea that you might use some of these same tricks or think of these same things when you apply this to your own prototypes, which are coming up. Okay, so here's just a series to give you a sense of the mapping process and the mapping layers, right? So this is as you're zooming in, kind of pinching in, you get closer and closer in until you get to a street view. And these three maps are a little bit confusing on here because we've got the one on the left is California, but then the middle and the right are here. And this is just to show you that if you did want to get out a little bit and stay 6 feet away from people and so on, it does look like there's 2 stories in Marion. I don't know what they are. I don't know what they're like, but if you want to go on an adventure, that would be a cool adventure to go on. And I would love to hear from you if you do that. Okay, so we're going to, though, zoom into some of these ones down in Los Angeles. So that's 16 down in Southern California. We're going to zoom into a couple of those, and specifically some that took place in the neighborhood of Los Feliz in Los Angeles. So we're zooming in. And as this middle map shows, there is this nice little cluster of 5 different field reports within this almost 1 to 5 city block kind of area right in Los Feliz on Vermont. And then the third map that shows the entrance fee block, that's just a shot to show you the interface of how this would work, that as you're walking down the street, when you come near one of these location tags, it turns green, and suddenly you have this trigger to tap to open it up and read. And you can also get a sense of how sensitive the location locking is by just looking at the circle around my little blue trigger, that even though we're right across the street from one of these other red ones, it has not actually turned that one on. We can only access the one that's green in that particular shot. So when we open that story, the entrance fee, it gives us, as I said, a little vignette, maybe like a 5-minute short read of a situation where I believe in this particular one, this guy in Los Feliz encounters one of the kids that can't speak, and the kid is acting as a bouncer in a club for the area or something like that. In this, I wish I could remember it better. I obviously can't get it again for you. But what I do want to point out, though, is some of the ways that the language of the vignette actually refers to specific things in the natural environment. So this left image is walking along the sidewalk of Russell Avenue. So you can see that from the map, right, where you can see Russell Avenue. This is actually walking that direction. So you can see on in the text, it actually says walking up Russell and heading towards Vermont, and then it finishes something like, I saw the kid standing wherever. Then another thing that it will call out is it'll make a reference to the parking lot with the sleeping neighbor sign. And this is actually directly across the street, where it's kind of this funky apartment building. And you can see underneath that window air conditioner box, it says, our neighbors are asleep, quiet please. So this is, again, just this kind of way of, in this one basically boring city block, right, without a whole lot going on, this particular writer has integrated that space right into this fictional world by pointing out these kind of weird, funky things that are happening in the space, right? So 1, simply being walking up the street, and 2, being this quiet please sign. And again, I wish that I had more quotes saved for you all to give you a better sense of where the story goes. But you can imagine kind of the ways that this might add a character from the story right over here, or a situation from the story that takes place in this parking lot, and so on. And the kind of added immersiveness or added realism that comes from standing in that parking lot where something may or may not have happened. Okay, and then the story continues. This is a bit later on in this same neighborhood, where we see again this reference to kind of iconic content that's around the neighborhood. So this key hanging down in front of the locksmith. In this instance, this is one full statement where he talks about encountering another one of these silent characters, standing with his back against the telephone pole, looking at the key hanging down in front of the locksmith. So in this case, you can see that there's a guy leaning against that telephone pole. That's actually my husband, who I had play this role for me while collecting this information and actually acting out the role of this particular character. So again, just to get a sense of how this is placing the real world right in direct conversation with the fictional world, but that you can access only when you're in this space. So you're kind of forced to engage with telephone poles, the key in front of the locksmith, the sleeping neighbor sign, and so on. So we're about to turn to the prototype and to close up this video. But what I just want to kind of highlight again here is the ways that this text uses the environment, the real world environment in the story, referencing very specific features directly, both to help orient the reader and to add this sense of immersiveness and realism to the fictional narrative, right? So kind of a way of saying, what if this totally crazy fictional event actually happened here? How would that play out in this space? So I hope that you will start thinking about that as you're kind of looking towards your own narrative prototypes, thinking about what kinds of specific spaces you could reference, whether in your neighborhoods, where you are now, if you're still in Conway, or if you're in Myrtle Beach, or at home somewhere else, like wherever that may be, what kinds of weird, quirky things are around your area, or what really specific things could you reference that could help build out this world, even within an imaginary narrative situation, as crazy as like kids just no longer being able to talk for some reason. All right, so to close up, this is our final point. I'm just going to say a little bit about the prototype so that you have a sense of kind of where we're headed, and then we will wrap this up. Okay, so for this prototype, we are no longer going to be using Eris. That was our kind of mobile location-specific model that we were going to use to create something like the silent history. Instead, we're going to be using Google Tour Builder, which, as I noted on Moodle, is more similar to the LA flood interface. But what we're going to be doing is, instead of creating a story that is like the LA flood story, just based in this kind of virtual map, what I'd like you to actually do instead is embrace the spirit of prototyping and create a true prototype, which really simply models what you would do if you were able to do the one that you really wanted to do, or the ideal, which would of course be the mobile narrative. So you're effectively going to be using the Google Tour Builder to approximate what you would do if we weren't kind of stuck in these limited mobility spaces, right? So if we could gather, if we could move freely about, what would your narrative look like under normal conditions? How would it use space? How would it use the world? How could you move your player or reader through space for real? What would you do? And then you'll use Google Tour Builder to create a model of that using images. And these images can come from maps. They can come from your own photo stream, the internet, whatever. So images, you can use sound clips, videos, text, all range of multimedia things to try and create as close to an immersive experience as you can, but knowing that this is actually kind of the proof of concept prototype of what your mobile app would look like if we could build that true mobile app. So I'm finalizing the specs and the assignment sheet. You should see that by the end of this week, the actual week, not the end of your course week, so Friday. So I'm finalizing them, but just to kind of clarify for you, the at minimum, the assignment will include multimedia. You must use at least 10 locations, which also have to be tagged, right? So clearly embedded in the map. You need to consider both forms of mobile narrative, right? So both the node and the edge. And as a quick reminder, right, the node focus is going to be the model like the Silent History or Pokemon Go. The edge model is going to be like Zombies Run, right, where it focuses on movement through space. You can decide kind of artistically and creatively if you want to focus on one of these modes over another. But I do need to see evidence that there's at least both of them are considered at least one time in the story. Excuse me. Then there will, as usual, there will be a designer statement. It'll actually be in some ways really extra important this time, since you're truly making a prototype, right? That's pretty different from the thing that of the final version of this, but so there will be a designer statement, and I'm still working on how we're going to conduct the playtests, but you can look for information about that this weekend at the latest. Okay, so that does conclude this video, and please feel free to reach out to me with any questions. Please continue to practice good social distancing, wash your hands, take care of yourselves, and everything else. And I look forward to seeing your geolocative prototypes in a couple of weeks.